Oh, now, walkouts. That can't be right. Welcome, everyone, to this final session of day one. Welcome also, I'm told, to people on the web that are joining in. Who knows? If this goes well, we could go viral. You never know. Despite the innocuous title of this session, I suspect it might be one of the more challenging items of the agenda, because we're trying to get these three wise men to tell us what's in the AE review. I don't like our chances, if I'm honest, but we'll give it a good go. And my job here is moderator, which I suspect is quite an easy job, although I don't know how out of hand this might get, but we will deal with that when it comes. Just by way of kicking off, I've been afforded a full 5 minutes to give my view on life, so I have never been one to knock that back. So, in respect of the view from the coalface, if you like, if I can put it that way, the things that are important to our members at Now Pensions, and indeed I suspect all members of auto-enrolment schemes, and indeed having sat through the last couple of sessions, every topic I've got to talk about has already been touched on. There's nothing new in the world, and we know this, but there are still problems that we need to face and problems we need to solve. So, fair to say, auto-enrolment, a bigger success than probably anyone dared hope. Opt-out rates lower than anyone dared expect. Millions of people inside a pension that were never in sight of any pension provision previously, but equally, the same amount of people not in a pension still. Otto earlier referenced the FCA report which came out today, which said that 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds have absolutely zero private pension. I mean, that is a real concern. That is a real concern. So, although we've been so successful in terms of policy and in terms of implementation in the first number of years, there are no laurels to be rested upon. There is still so much to do, but we're so far advanced from where we were in 2012. So there's lots of talk about coverage, lots of talk about particularly the self-employed, lots of talk about the so-called gig economy. I don't really know what that is, but everyone seems to be talking about it. But it's clearly an issue we need to deal with. I mean, this is a very large section of our population who currently are not enveloped in what we're talking about in terms of policy. I'm sure the wise gentleman on the side will refer to that soon. And then we've got adequacy. I mean, again, we've heard that a lot already. And the wise words of the youngsters in the previous session, I mean, quite frankly, the combined wisdom here in this room of the pensions industry has probably been shot down just by what they're saying, because I think they've got it right. You know, life becomes too complicated, and we need to simplify. 95%, from a Now Pensions point of view, 95% of our employers pay the minimum. Of course they do. The minimums are increasing. That's a good thing. But when you're talking about the minimums, as they stand at the moment, for an average earner, you're talking about £400 a year. That's nowhere near enough. It's a great start. We're not there. We need that roadmap, which takes us beyond the 2 to 5, the 5 to 8, takes us to the 12, takes us beyond the 12. You know, life doesn't happen instantly. We all know this. But we need to have that thought. We need to have that drive. We need to have that plan. We talk a lot about engagement. Indeed, the last session was a lot about engagement. But, you know, we've got an upcoming contribution increase in a few months' time. You know, how many people are really aware of what that's about? How many people are going to be surprised when in April they have a higher deduction coming through on their payslip? So, engagement, communication, obviously, very important. And something which is sort of dear to my heart, and certainly to that of Now Pensions, is ultimately who wears the burden for this. The way that the minimum contributions are structured at the moment ends up skewing the cost more to the employee than the employer. Is that right? It may well be. But I don't think we've had that debate. And if you look at how that positions us here in the UK versus some of the other countries which we've already mentioned, the Japans of this world, the Australias, the New Zealands, that skew is counterintuitive almost. We need to have that debate, and we need to have that plan as well. So, again, like I say, nothing new in the world, but still problems that we need to address. And like I say, the three wise men will tell us all about it, and we'll be extremely well informed by the time we finish the next 40 minutes. So on that basis, I will hand over to Jamie, who's going to kick us off. And once the gents have had their say, then you can pick holes through everything they say, and indeed what they haven't said, we'll leave enough time for some Q&A. So we'll get the debate going. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Troy. Tickety boo, Hillary Clinton and Knickerbocker glory are the three words that my colleagues challenged me to get into this speech about automatic enrolment. It's easy. So, first of all, just maybe reflect on, I think the number now of auto-enrollees is what, 8.7 million, I think we are now talking about 8.7 million people. Do you know, it's easy to get lost in a debate about the detail of aspects of auto-enrolment, things we think we need to do, and of course there are things we need to do, but it's easy to even write negative articles about what is an astonishing feat of getting 8.7 million people in so far, and counting, to auto-enrolment, to the workplace pension, to the savings habit, hopefully. Time will tell whether that's the case. And it's also easy, I think, for us to sort of self-reflect and say, well, haven't pension providers done well and risen to the challenge? Haven't corporate advisors done well? And accountants have done a great job, and payroll companies have done a great job, and of course trustee boards have been involved in that, and so on. And that's absolutely true. I think the one party we rarely talk about, who really have been the sort of backbone of all of this, have been employers. And it's quite easy to overlook the fact that we have some, and I think again the number is around 800,000 employers, ranging from the big employers represented in the room, many of which are represented in the room today, for whom it's been about the transition, usually from an older scheme to a newer scheme, or a conversion of a DC scheme from one thing to another. And of course, hundreds of thousands of very small employers for whom it's been about, often with no expertise, setting up a workplace pension for the first time ever and putting people in who have never been in a pension before. So the challenge is quite profound. And yet, right through all of our first 5 years, we've seen quite remarkable success so far. So I'd just like to pause for a second before I say anything about the review, and I will come on to the review. But before I say anything about that, just pause for a second and give a sustained round of applause to employers. Keep it going. Louder. Louder. Right, stop. So the job's only half done. Calm down. So the job is only half done. I mean, I'm serious. It's a serious point. I think we need to recognise the role of employers, because we've counted on them thus far to champion the cause. We're counting on them over the next couple of years to do the really important part of getting contributions, not just getting people in, but getting contributions up, and that's the next couple of years of focus. So, so far, so good. It has been a roaring success, but there are areas we want to look at, and the review, of course, plays to those points. What else do we need to do? And of course, there are a number of people not included currently, and questions around whether or not we should include them, and there are questions around what we do with various other aspects that my colleagues will talk to in terms of contributions and engagement. My task was to look at coverage, and so I can't tell you the answers. I think that's been made quite clear. The answers aren't there yet. The review will conclude in December, and then the answers will be given as to the response to the consultation that took place. We did have a consultation, you may recall, back in March, April this year, and we asked a number of questions on each of the three themes across coverage, contributions and engagement. We had a very strong response to that. So formally there were 60 plus, I think, formal responses provided with a huge amount of detail and a lot of evidence given, which was really, really useful. The consultation didn't end there. We've been engaging with and speaking to employers and trustees and trade bodies and charities and all sorts of other people since then, and really right up until we stand here today, we've been continuing to listen to what people have had to say about it. And of course, a lot of these conversations are developing. They don't start and finish with the consultation. They develop in a debate. So I think we've almost exhausted the number of questions we can ask of various stakeholders, and we're now at the stage where we do need to make some conclusions. I can give you a flavour of what the responses were on my work stream around coverage, which I think some you'll find, hopefully some you'll find fairly obvious, and many of you would have been respondents. So we asked the question around, I'll start with, should we exclude anyone from automatic enrolment? So there were some representations about perhaps there are certain categories of worker for whom auto-enrolment isn't appropriate and should we seek to exclude them. And generally speaking, in fact, fairly overwhelmingly, the response has been that that would be perhaps a dangerous precedent. So responses so far have been that most people don't agree that anybody should be excluded. And quite the contrary, the next question was around should we include further people in auto-enrolment, which was perhaps the more obvious thrust of the very review. And unilaterally, people agree that yes, we should seek to build on the success of auto-enrolment and include more people. When you then ask exactly who should be included and how, it's very varied in its response, and there is little consensus as to exactly who that should be. There is, of course, a big discussion about the self-employed. The self-employed, to be clear, and certainly a learning experience for me, not by any stretch a homogenous group of people, very varied in its makeup, from those who earn a lot and run a business to those who are in the gig economy and just starting out and looking to earn some money, and everything in between that perhaps we considered the traditional self-employed, which doesn't necessarily lend itself to one easy magic bullet solution, and that's been, again, quite clear in the feedback. Most people would say, yes, let's do something to get the self-employed saving, auto-enrolment or otherwise, but few people necessarily agree on the answer as to how and exactly which groups, which in itself is not a bad thing. And to be clear, we've had some fantastic feedback on that particular subject. To name but a few, Royal London, Aviva, People's Pension, and also a recent report from Old Mutual and PPI, a fantastic bank of evidence around the things that we could do and the people that are in that population. So we're very appreciative of that. And then just briefly, other things we've heard are, we asked questions around the £10,000 earnings trigger as to exactly who should be brought in. The feedback has generally been quite varied, ranging from those who believed and have been quite vocal that it should be removed entirely or reduced, to those who think it should be increased and some who think it should remain the same. And equally around ages, although I would argue most people suggest that there's little logic in age 22 as a starting point. There's little consensus around what the age should be, and equally around state pension age, a lack of consensus. But nobody really significantly saying we should raise the age 22 and exclude more people, or indeed reduce the state pension age outer limit and exclude more people at that end. So that's probably I would like to say in a nutshell, but I'm sure I've overrun. Briefly, what we've had as feedback so far, and obviously we'll pick up any questions. The key thing is we will be in just a few weeks' time seeking to launch the report and giving conclusions.
Thank you, Jamie. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Curry, Director of the Pensions Policy Institute. The strand that I've been co-chairing, or the review co-chairing, the strand I've been chairing, is the contribution strand, or as Richard Harrington said to me when he asked me to do it, the easy bit of the review. So how much higher than 8% should the contribution rate to automatic enrolment be is definitely not the question that I've been asked to look at, and is definitely not something which will be addressed by the review. So the terms of reference for the review around contributions is charging us with setting out the evidence base about which to make future decisions around the contribution rate. And I'll come back in a few minutes as to why that's definitely the right approach to take and why we should be thinking about it now. But in some ways, actually, the question about contributions does seem to be one of the easier ones. So we have lots of evidence that suggests that if all somebody does is save in an automatic enrolment scheme at the basic minimum, even if it's right the way through their working life, they're not likely to end up with what they might consider to be an adequate income in retirement. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. If you go back right to the Pensions Commission, we've already heard about how well they did that research and report and the recommendations they made. They were very clear that automatic enrolment was only the first part of getting people from the basic state pension and state second pension as it was then, now the new state pension, up to what might be considered an adequate income in retirement. Now, we might think there are different ways of now determining what's adequate. It could be the 2/3 of final salary for an average earner or a median earner, which the Pensions Commission used, where automatic enrolment at 8% would get you halfway there. Or it could be, as we've heard, or will hear later, I think, about hitting the target, a different type of approach to a flat rate target income, for example, that might be used. But on most of the measures that are used, we know that automatic enrolment, as it's currently set out, is not enough to get people there. But that's the easy bit. Okay, so the difficult bit is thinking about actually how automatic enrolment fits in a much wider scheme of things. So even if we go back to the consultation responses, which Jamie's been talking about, although nearly every response that we had suggested that there might need to be at some point an increase in minimum contributions, there was no consensus at all about what the right level should be, or how it should be implemented, or when it should be implemented, or who should bear the burden of doing that. And then you start taking into account all the other things that we know are going on around automatic enrolment, even within automatic enrolment. So obviously the amount of contributions or the rate of contribution is going to be very closely linked to what happens on coverage or what happens on consumer engagement on top of the automatic enrolment saving, how we work with voluntary saving. But also factor in things like the state pension age change. So how long are people going to need to be working for and what's the length of their retirement going to be? How is extending working lives or fuller working lives going to change the relationship between saving and taking income? How is the state pension going to evolve over time, and how is that going to affect how much people need in retirement? What other assets are people going to have, either through different savings products such as the lifetime ISA or through housing wealth, and how's that going to change by generation? So you can see there's an awful lot going on that we need to think about when we're trying to think purely about what the automatic enrolment contribution level might be. It's not something we can look at in isolation. So it's going to be quite difficult, I think, to come up with a single answer in the short term, and that's why I think it's right that the review has decided, or was set out in the terms of reference, that actually now is not the right time to decide what the rate should be long term in the future. And one of the reasons for that is we still haven't actually fully implemented automatic enrolment as is currently set out. So you can view it in two stages. The coverage stage, getting everybody into automatic enrolment, getting all those employers through and operating automatic enrolment systems, should be finished in the next couple of months. As Jamie said, we've done very well there, and actually that's gone as well as anybody ever expected it to go, probably slightly better with very low opt-out rates, very high compliance from employers. It's going well. What we don't know is how individuals are going to react when we see increases in the contribution rate, and in particular in the employee contribution rate, next April and the following April. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that we're likely to see opt-outs or people dropping out of pension saving in high numbers as a result of that change. And actually, because it's coming in April, because it's coming in at the same time as a number of other things change, national minimum living wage changes and changes in personal taxation and things like that, although we don't know what's going to be in the budget. Obviously, we're expecting things to happen. So people may not be aware. We know that inertia is very powerful. So actually we may not see too much change in behaviour, but we may see a change in behaviour. So it's important that we have that evidence base and we know what's happening before we decide what we want to do longer term. So it's really important that we have facts on which to base the results. It wouldn't be any good us saying we think the contribution rate needs to be higher if we suddenly find that opt-outs have gone up significantly over the next 2 to 3 years because of the way in which automatic enrolment and the individual contribution is received by employees. So there's a lot of work for us to carry on doing, I think, and what we're aiming to do in the review is, to, as I said, to set out this evidence base so we know where we're starting from. I think it's fairly clear that we want to set out a direction of travel, and I think we'll want to set out where we think the system will evolve in the future, but it's also very clear that this is not the end of the process for automatic enrolment. Automatic enrolment is at the start of a journey which is going to take a long time before it's actually finished, if it's ever finished. It's something which will evolve over time. So I mentioned at the start that actually there was some consensus that people need to save more, and I think that's the one thing that we will take away, that actually contributions into workplace pension saving will need to be higher in the future, whether that's done through automatic enrolment or whether that's done through voluntary saving or whether it's actually done outside the workplace is a question that I think we'll come back to later on. But if we can provide enough evidence, then hopefully it will be an informed decision and something that will last and prove successful as automatic enrolment has been so far. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I thought the last lot actually cracked the problem. Did you notice they didn't mention one word of jargon? They had a very simple conversation. Now, the stream that I've been working on as part of the automatic enrolment review is engagement. And the objective there is to see how we can improve engagement to create more greater personal ownership so people can make better and informed choices. Now, when we've looked around the world and countries that are more advanced than us, we've found that everybody said there's no silver bullet. It's a real challenge. There are a lot and different things, and I can share some of those later, that distract people and make it really difficult, particularly if the expectation of engagement is to get people to pay more in. Now, one of the points that was made quite early on was around a concern with engagement around inertia. Inertia, people said, has been the sole catalyst for everybody staying in and saving for the first time. I think that's pretty true, but actually I think there's something else, because I've spoken to a lot of people from many different areas, and what they tell me is actually the advertising campaign from the DWP, You're In, all the work that employers have done and the providers kind of reinforced the message. We kind of created the start of social norming. The natural thing to say for the future being the right thing. So I think that engagement is really important. I think it's challenging, but I think together there are a number of things that we can do. Now, one of the points that was raised, in fact, there are a couple as sort of not barriers, maybe more challenges. First of all is the language that we use. And the second was around the annual statement, which is why I reached out to Quiet Room and also to Eversheds working with the PLSA. So just look at the words that we use. And it's interesting, actually, because I think one of the guys on the last session said, I don't understand money purchase. We've actually created a legacy of jargon. Money purchase, defined contribution, retirement savings. Just look at all that lot. And then just thinking it from an individual's point of view. So if you've got a number of providers, a number of savings, and you're getting lots of annual statements through, we're using different words, different language. We're putting numbers in different places on the statement. The numbers are different at different dates. And by the way, those numbers are based on different assumptions. So even if you really wanted to get behind your numbers and try and think about planning for the future, it's really hard because you put them all together and you can't really make sense of it. I think the other thing, of course, is we don't provide any kind of target. And some work has been done in Australia in 2004. And of course, there's a session tomorrow from the PLSA around hitting the target. Again, people want that kind of support around what is it that I need to do? And that's probably quite a personal thing. But just coming back to the jargon, look at that last bit. I thought, well, I'll just write a sentence, and I put my pension technical head on. And I came up with that, frankly, rubbish. And then I don't know, has anybody had a relevant accretion recently? I don't want you to be embarrassed or anything, but you can own up. It's actually a good thing. Believe it or not, It's something you become entitled to after your benefit has been paid. But I think you see the point. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do together. The other really interesting thing, as I spoke to people and I spoke to providers, and there's been some phenomenal work being done in different areas of the industry. So, for example, Nest, the ABI have provided a guide on simple language, what they're trying to roll out through the industry. But bring it back to that person who has all these statements coming to them. The problem is that we're creating almost regional dialects because we're all trying to keep it simple, but maybe using different words, which means they have no consistency. And that's a real problem. In fact, one person said to me, I have to be a multilingualist to be able to understand the stuff that I get. And that was the person who I believe was pretty much engaged. The other problem that we've got to think about in terms of helping with engagement, we've got to recognize that information is all over the place. So if I've got different pension pots that with different providers, it's very hard for me to get all that information in one place and make sense of it. And this is probably where technology has a place. And again, I had some great feedback on technology and some real honesty where people said, again, it's not a silver bullet. It didn't make the difference that they thought it could make. But I think we have to think more holistically about engagement. It's contributions from lots of different areas that will make that difference. But the good thing about technology, let's just think about the pension dashboard for an example. If we can bring all that information into one place, we can make it simple, same words, it's consistent. We can then have a conversation throughout the year. We can use personalization, we can nudge on birthdays, because when we do that for you, and that's you personally, we have the ability to talk to people with all their information in one place, and then they can get a sense of what it's about. I would encourage you, coming back to the annual statement, we're going to be handing these around, to give us your feedback on that. And the reason I was really passionate about it is because even at Tesco, we've struggled really, if I'm honest, to find something that people really understand and creates a conversation, because that's what I always want to create out of any communication. Something that generates curiosity, creates that conversation, and then leads people to start thinking about what more they need to do. But the problem is there's been some phenomenal work done across the industry again, but in fact those statements are still quite long. And there are personal challenges. People have little time, they have distractions, other priorities, and that means that we're competing for time. So if we're going to communicate and we're going to engage, we've got to think really carefully about keeping it simple, keeping it short, and making it relevant. But this statement hopefully is on one page, 2 sides. You won't find, I mean, you can challenge me if you do, but you shouldn't find a single word of jargon in it. In fact, I don't think it mentions the P word. And the approach that we took, we said, let's understand the sentiment of the regulation. Let's just start from there. And then let's look at what really matters to members. What's the information they need? Because interestingly, when we saw the video before, they said, well, we don't need a lot of stuff. We might need different information at later stages in our lives, but right now, just give me a sense of, how much I'm paying, my employer's paying, how much I've built up and how it's changing. And of course, there was further information about, can you help me think about the difference it makes if I pay more? So have a look at the statement. It is in the Learning Hub tomorrow. And it'll be really interesting to get your honest feedback on that. And maybe perhaps as an industry, we don't need regulation for this, but maybe as an industry, move together to a standardized statement. But again, as part of an ongoing journey, we've also got technology, as Steve said. We have to think about, as time moves forward, people's preferences, mobile devices, and how we can get to people in the most effective way. So, thank you, first of all, for everything you've done, for all the participation in the engagement stream and in entire automatic enrolment review. It's been really helpful. What I do hope is this is the start of a journey where we can work together and make a real difference for members. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, gents. We've got plenty of time for Q&A, so please put your hand up while I wrestle with the technology. because I'm sure that there is a load of questions streaming in. Have we got one? Oh, let's take, completely out of order, let's take number 3.
Thanks. Andy Cheseldine, Capital Cranfield. Question on coverage. Sorry, Jamie. You mentioned that 8.7 million people have been auto-enrolled. We had 10.5 million already in pension schemes. But ignoring the self-employed, there were 7.7 million people who did not get auto-enrolled. Too young, too old, don't earn enough. So that's broadly half of the population didn't get auto-enrolled. What do you think a reasonable proportion for auto-enrolment is?
Yeah, it's a very good question. When you said, Jamie, you said that 8.7 million people have been auto-enrolled, I thought you were about to ask their names. I do know them, of course. It's a good point. I mean, this is really the thrust of the review. So it is asking the question, you know, all told, we end up with maybe 10 million people auto-enrolled. A large number of those are new to workplace saving. There are then populations of people, or cohorts of people, if you like, in different categories by young age, older age, income, etc., multiple jobs, who are not included under the current rules. And to be honest, the questions are actually targeted at those very cohorts to say, should we extend it to include some or all of those people? So the review will seek to answer that question. What is a good proportion saving? I mean, I think it depends what we agree on who we should have saving. So there are question marks around, you know, you could say, well, as a purist, you might say absolutely everyone who is working in any capacity should be in a pension scheme of some sort. And that would probably be true if we had no other form of retirement provision, but of course we do have a state pension, and we need to ask questions around the balance between, for example, those on the lowest earnings and what they'll get from the state pension versus affordability of paying contributions now. So we'll seek to answer those questions. I can't give you an answer because it's made up of different parts. But I think certainly we're looking at how do we expand that.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Shall we go for number 4?
As a pensions manager, I'm disappointed that the panel who are conducting this review has not mentioned the word affordability. Now, I think we all know that there's pressure on wages, particularly for the young. And there's going to be an increase in auto-enrolment contributions, which are going to have effect on people's wages. And not one of you has mentioned that at all.
Well, I was going to, if we can just go to the next.
Yeah,
one of the things that technology, come on. Next slide.
Yep.
There we go. One of the things that is really important is affordability. I talked before about the challenge around engagement, and that's about not just engagement, but also in terms of people thinking about paying more, which ultimately we would like people to do. And there are a number of challenges. And you can see here, time is one of them. So if you've got children, the statistic is you have no more than 17 minutes to yourself each day. Distracted by debt. So we've heard lots of information coming out from the FCA today. We know that average household debt's around about 12,700, student debt coming out of university of 50,800. So this is one of the key reasons why perhaps we're not seeing people, particularly at this time of the economy, actually choosing to pay more. So apologies if we didn't mention it, but it's absolutely at the back of our minds. And you know, as we think forwards about how auto-enrolment will develop and contributions go up, trust me, we're thinking very carefully about that. If I might just take the opportunity, since I've now got the slide up. The other real challenge is, just coming back to engagement, like to hug the limelight, is the fact that it's really hard, because the reality is if you're an individual, your time is precious, you're distracted by debt. The amount of information we get a day in a 12-hour working day, Monday to Friday, is about 105,000 words. If you add pictures, videos, television, it's the equivalent to 34 gigabytes. We can't consume that, we can't make sense of it. Low savings. 40% of UK workers have less than £100 of savings. So coming back to affordability, you know, there are other priorities in terms of thinking about the short term. And then also a low level of knowledge. So 1 in 20 adults have the literacy or numeracy of a 5-year-old. What that means in practice is that when they get in a lift, they don't know which button to press. So there are lots of distractions, there are lots of challenges that when we think about engagement, when we think about communication, we've really got to think about individuals in the world that they're in today and look at how we can make things simpler. But coming back to the original question, debt, affordability is very much at the forefront of our minds.
Yeah, and if I could just build on that, I mean, obviously one of the reasons why we think that now is not the right time to think about what the contribution rate might be, but to look at the evidence from what happens over the next couple of years with employee contributions increasing, is to see how much pressure that puts, to see how people react to that, to see what the responses are to that. And equally, if I can just speak on Jamie's topic for a bit, on the coverage side about who we include and who we don't include, affordability is a key issue in that, in trying to work out who we think would benefit from automatic enrolment, not just in terms of their retirement, but in terms of how they're living now, what that balance and trade-off is. And one of the things that I think is broader maybe than the review, but worth bearing in mind, is also about the financial resilience of people. And so other work that the PPI has done with, for example, the Step Change Debt Charity is thinking about how, if individuals find themselves in debt or in trouble, what can be done if they have pension saving to try and avoid them having a really hard working life, if they've got money there that could help them and stop things getting worse and worse. So it's definitely a much broader issue that kind of flows through everything that we're thinking about, even if we neglected to mention it specifically.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I did mention it briefly in my answer to Andy as well. I think it's a big question for the lowest earners. You're absolutely right, and I apologise, I didn't mention it. Perhaps implicit, I think it's implicit in talking about the need to make sure that we get through the next couple of years, because that challenge is not yet proven to be conquered, for all the reasons of affordability. I do, and I'm now kicking myself, because I would normally, in that same breath, talk about the fact that for many people at low earnings levels, it will be the difference between £10 a month as is, £30 a month and then 50. And that's really important, because 10, 30 and 50 to somebody who is not earning a huge amount of money relate to 3 quite different things each month that they would have to give up. And that is crucial. So I don't underestimate that, and I take your point entirely.
Okay, thanks. Number 3.
It's Alistair McQueen from Aviva. Thanks for the update, everybody. Jamie, you mentioned the report should come in the coming weeks. In the spirit of clear communications, is that before the budget or before Christmas? And secondly, when the Turner report was launched, there was a relative air of political and economic calm. We don't have that economic and political calm today. You used the phrase you were seeking to release the report. I'm interested in what level of political interference or oversight will there be before you publish your report?
Yeah, okay, good question. Thanks, Alistair. Will it be before the budget? No, almost certainly not. Budget is in end of November, isn't it? Will it be before Christmas? Yes, that's absolutely the plan, and that remains on track, despite rightly you pointing out the number of challenges it faces. I mean, it's funny because you look back at this year and you say, you know, you can cite a number of things really, not least of which was an unexpected general election and the formation of a coalition and issues as we see the economy doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things. You could point to those issues this year, you could probably point to those same sorts of issues over the last 5 years. And yet, I go back to this point, despite that, we've had huge success in getting people in to give up at least a small amount of money towards saving into a workplace pension. So, you know, so far it's almost like, you know, don't say too much about it, stop tempting fate, because we've, you know, despite everything, it seems to be so resilient in getting this programme through. I don't think you could pick a more difficult set of circumstances over the last few years to try and do this, and had you planned it, you wouldn't. I'm quite sure we'll continue to face those challenges as we go forward. But the answer to your question is, it is on track. despite those things, as it was to deliver by the end of the year, let's say by Christmas.
Okay. Maybe I'll take a question from the app, which might be initially to you, Chris, perhaps. What signs are there of employers increasing their contributions to match higher employee levels over the next couple of years?
It's a good question, and the honest answer is we don't really know what employers are going to do and how they're going to respond. I think what's interesting is there is some limited evidence that the automatic enrolment process has enabled or encouraged some employers to do more than just the minimum that they're required to do. Although I think, to be fair, not that many more. I think most of the employers who were already engaged with pensions were probably already doing more than the minimum, but most of the ones who have come in subsequently have I mean, not all of them, but a large proportion have probably taken the path of least resistance and done what they need to do to be compliant, which is perhaps not surprising if they're small employers who have never really had an interest in pension saving or had any experience of doing so. I think what is interesting, and maybe it kind of cuts across some of the streams we've been looking at, is there is kind of international experience that where employers tend to make higher contributions or match contributions, there's generally better employee response and engagement in that. And in particular, some of the evidence that we received from some of the company-specific plans in the US were talking about kind of automatic enrolment and auto-escalation and matching all together in the same program, actually having a really powerful effect on getting contributions even amongst the lower earners. And persistency amongst the lower earners much higher than we're talking about in terms of the minimum here. So not sure if there will be employers who decide they're going to do more as a result, but certainly if there were, there's a potential for it to have a really positive impact on outcomes overall.
Yeah, very briefly, I just today I noticed, and I'm trying to avoid overly plugging it, but there was a great bit of research I saw this afternoon at the Aon stand. They've done a bit of research on large employers with one fact that jumped off the page at me. And to be clear, it's only 2 pages, the whole summary, you'd be impressed. But there was one fact that jumped off the page, which was that I think it said 40% of larger firms that were surveyed will have to make some changes still to contribution rates prior to 2019. I didn't know that. I think we almost work on the assumption that all large companies are paying above. And I appreciate it may not be all staff, it may be a category, but nonetheless, that jumped off the page for me.
Okay, we've got time for one more. Number 4.
Good afternoon. Someone coming from Croydon Council. The question is, why can't you make it auto-enrolment compulsory for everybody? People pay national insurance. When they go up, they don't feel it. But you talk about affordability, that they can't afford to pay the pension. But it's based on their lifestyle. You've seen all these youths, the life they're living in, it's more spending. And when they're in trouble, then they cry that they can't afford anything. If it becomes compulsory, look like at a country like Australia, it's compulsory. And how can they do that? Why can't you compare Australia? Look like a country like America, people get a second job to pay for their insurance, for their pension. For us, just say that they can't afford it, and then take that as a grant that they don't care. People are going to live 100 years. Who's going to pay for their pension or for their maintenance?
Yeah, we are a nation of spenders rather than savers. It's a fundamental point that we need to change. Now, I don't think it's a binary thing. We clearly need to spend as well, but I think that the balance is tipped somewhat. And there's evidence, certainly I've seen studies that suggest that we haven't particularly learnt from where we were 10 years ago in terms of the levels of debt that people were building up at a personal level. So this is not just about the nudge in auto-enrolment and pensions, of course. There's a whole wider thing around people building up debt on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis, which is beyond the scope of this review, but nonetheless is important in the wider scheme of things. And I think you're right, there's a social change that we probably need to make. Some of it as well, acknowledging that affordability is a key issue. I can't underestimate that. But equally, there is a question of priority. And we don't, at the moment, place saving for the short or long term above quite a number of other things in our lives. And that's a question mark we need to wrestle with.
I mean, just to add to that as well, it's quite interesting when we looked at the last session. So if we looked about a year ago, you know, 900 quid in a Louis Vuitton bag and all that, going out, eating. But they're now through that engagement, by taking the time, speaking simply, explaining it, they're starting to think differently, and therefore they've changed their priorities. So it's an absolutely valid point, but again, is this the role for engagement? How can we help people understand there is a balance, acknowledging affordability, just getting that right between saving for the short term, making sure if you do have debt, you pay that down and act responsibly, but also there's a need to save for the long term too. So I think it cuts across all areas.
Just quickly.
Just to make it very clear that compulsory pensions is outside the scope of the review. And it's definitely a political decision as to whether they should do that. But I think, interestingly, one of the key objectives of automatic enrolment long term going forward, and which we've touched on a little bit in all of this through how many people are covered and how we engage with them and how much they pay, is actually trying to change the social norming around savings, and especially savings for the long term. So saving through a workplace pension just becomes something that you do. So when people get their first pay packet and they see tax, national insurance, pension contribution, they assume it's going to be there all the way rest through the working life. And if we can do something like that, then actually we've got a chance of changing that kind of spending culture to at least be spending after you've actually taken care of a long-term saving. So that's one of the long-term objectives for automatic enrolment, I think.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, guys. We're out of time, and we could literally go on for quite some time. There's a load of questions that have been submitted by you, so thank you. Interestingly, there's only been one question submitted by the person, perhaps, who's watching on the web, and that is, why did I wear these socks? Which is quite a hard-hitting question, and the answer, of course, is because I like them. So, so thank you for that. That was great. Thank you, guys, for that. And we all look forward to seeing the review in its final form. And thank you all for attending. There are a number of other fringe events that are going on now, so please make use of those. And I think there will be something up on screen in a moment about feedback via the app for the session, so please make sure you do that as well. So thank you very much.